السلام عليكم. اليوم راح أشرح عن Immunology of Rheumatoid Arthritis. طبعا بدأت اللكتشر بأول سؤال اللي هو Which of the following is not an autoimmune disorder? Rheumatoid arthritis is an autoimmune disorder. Systemic lupus erythematosus من اسمها يعني systemic, and we talked about it يعني a lot in the hypersensitivities وهاي الأشياء. It's an autoimmune disease. Graves' disease is an autoimmune disease. Antibodies that mimic the effect of TSH stimulates the thyroid gland causing hyperthyroidism أخذناه بالفونديشن. فالباقية اللي هو ulcerative colitis. تمام؟ ننتقل هسه هي ulcerative colitis. هسه عندنا autoimmune diseases. There are like more than 100 autoimmune diseases. شنو معنى autoimmunity? It's basically immunity against the self. احنا اخذنا انه بالثايمس يصير اكو شيء اسمه thymic education للتي سيلز، بحيث وطبعا نفس الشيء بالنسبه للبون مارو بالبي سيلز البون مارو، بس المهم انه يصير اكو selection, positive selection بالثايمس. This selection aims to eradicate any of the self-reactive lymphocytes. زين؟ But sometimes this process is not perfect. Some self-reactive T cells can escape this selection and go. When these self-reactive T cells or B cells are activated in the lymph nodes, شو راح يصير؟ راح يسوي attack للبادي tissue. ممكن يكون blood مثل عندنا lupus erythematosus, GI tract, nerves, skin, muscles, bones, thyroid. فهاي شغلة autoimmune diseases. Loss of self-tolerance. هي overview التولرنس. هسه بالنسبة لل tolerance والselection, it occurs in the primary lymphoid organs والsecondary lymphoid organ. هسه بالبرايمري اللي هو البون مارو والثايمس يصير عندنا السنترال tolerance اللي مثل ما موضح بهذا المربع. إذا مثل ما تلاحظون إنه B cells and T cells are formed، وبعدين شنو يصير عندهم؟ يصير عندهم selection, negative and positive selection. The positive selection actually makes it and doesn't die. أما بالنسبة للنيجاتيف selection اللي هي it includes self-reactive T cells, it either undergo deletion اللي هو apoptosis, or if it was a B cell, it's given a chance to change, to edit its receptor editing. أو if it recognizes the self-antigen, it may develop into the regulatory T lymphocytes اللي هي CD4 cells, يعني branch of the CD4 cells. هسه this central tolerance is not 100% accurate. Not 100% accurate. فشنو some self-reactive T cells or B cells can escape these primary lymphoid organs and go into the secondary. I said they are formed in the primary, go into the secondary, wait until they encounter the pathogen. هسه فرضا self-reactive T cells or B cell is present in the lymph node. If it recognizes the self-antigen, alhamdulillah, our body has processes in order to get rid of these self-reactive. Process called peripheral tolerance. Either the cell undergoes deletion, apoptosis, or energy by inhibitory receptors مثلا CTLA4 وهذا، أو suppression from what? From the regulatory T cells. تمام؟ فهي هاي الشغلة اللي هنا اللي تصير. عندنا central tolerance تصير بالprimary lymphoid organ، وعندنا peripheral tolerance. This ensures that we don't have self-reactive T or B cells. But sometimes something can go wrong. وهسه we're gonna describe it. When something goes wrong, what will happen is loss of self-tolerance. لما يصير عندنا activation self-reactive T cells or B cells, يعني the immune system will become intolerant to the body, will start attacking the body, would result in autoimmune disease اللي هو ال AI. طبعا it's still, the cause is still unknown by the way. بس هناك هواية hypothesis explaining how the tolerance mechanism can fall. هي two. The first hypothesis شغلة إلها علاقة بالgenetic, genetic or hormonal influence, or together are known or suspected to play a significant role, and we're gonna explain how. The second hypothesis اللي هو previous infections and or inflammatory responses caused by these infections have been implicated in the development of several autoimmune diseases, and we're gonna explain how again. There are 6 methods when it comes to this hypothesis. فهنا مثل ما تلاحظون دي وضح لنا انه genetic susceptibility due to genetic defects, mutations, يؤدي الى شغلة اللي هي failure of self tolerance. Self-reactive lymphocytes are activated, okay, due to these genetic or hormonal influences, activated when they recognize the self antigen that is carried by by the APC. هسه APC carries the self antigen, activates the self-reactive lymphocytes, and it is not suppressed. احنا اخذنا انه peripheral tolerance we have mechanism either undergoes apoptosis or changes in the receptor. مو هذا هنا either undergoes apoptosis or energy or suppression, but due to defects caused by genetic causes its suppression ما يصير. فالself-reactive effector cell will proliferate and will start attacking the body tissue وإلى آخره. زين نجي هسه we go deep into the genetic susceptibility to autoimmune diseases. Among the genes that are associated with autoimmunity, the strongest association are with the MHC gene. شنو هو ال MHC gene؟ اللي هو major histocompatibility complex اللي هو بالهيومنز اسمه HLA. ما ادري اذا تتذكروها اخذناها باللاست سمستر بالنسبه للاورجن ترانسبلانت. there was a test called HLA, human leukocyte antigen. okay, ف HLA is basically the MHC in humans. تمام. احنا اللي اخذنا انه there are 2 types of MHC. you have MHC class 1 مثل ما تلاحظون, و MHC class 2. زين ال MHC class 1 are present in all nucleated cells, يعني all of the body cells except the cells that do not have the nucleus, like the red blood cell. okay, وال MHC class 2 it's present only on the APC, which includes the dendritic cell, includes the B cell, includes the macrophages. نجي هسه لل class 1 MHC. ال class 1 MHC هو شنو؟ ال MHC stands for what? As I said, major histocompatibility complex. It's a complex of proteins that are brought together in order to form what? In order to form خلي أرسم هنا. In order to form the molecule. خلي نفترض إنه this is the surface of a cell. This is a cell, body cell. وعندنا هنا ال MHC molecule. ال MHC molecule is a complex of protein. هسه احنا نتكلم عن ال class 1 MHC. Complex of proteins brought together. احنا أخذنا إنه there are 3 subtypes of class 1 MHC. شنو هي كانت عندنا طبعا MHC رح نتكلم عنها إنه HLA. كان عندنا class 1 HLA A B C. شنو هذول ال HLA HLA B HLA C? Basically these are the genes that codes for the proteins, and these proteins come together and form the MHC molecule. يعني هسه خلينا نفترض عندنا particularly chromosome 6 عندنا ال DNA strand. هذا ال DNA strand. Part of the DNA, this is called HLA. المهم HLA-A. This is HLA-B. This is HLA-C. This part is called A. ما أدري شوية هاي الكتابة صعبة هنا. A, B, C. This is the DNA strand. Within the DNA it contains genes. These genes codes for the proteins that come together in order to form the complex, the major histocompatibility complex. هسا within this gene, يعني مثلا خلينا نروح للجين A, HLA-A. It contains different alleles. One of it, for example, عندنا ال HLA-B27. تمام؟ وين ال HLA-B27? This is the HLA-B gene. Within this gene we have part of it is called HLA-B27. It codes for a protein. زين? And this protein is the one that is responsible for presenting the antigen. الانتيجين هذا can be foreign antigen, can be self antigen. فخلنا نفترض انه هذا هو البروتين اللي احنا نتكلم عنه formed by HLA-B27. It's the one that presents the self antigen. هسه for some reason a mutation can happen to this HLA-B27 allele. If there is a mutation in this allele within the HLA-B gene, راح يصير عندنا defective protein that presents the antigen. And this defective protein مكتوب هنا انه expression of a certain MHC allele may allow presentation of self-antigen that can predispose an individual to autoimmunity, which can cause abnormal selection and regulation of self-reactive lymphocyte. يعني هسه مثلا كان عندنا self-reactive lymphocytes in the lymph node. هسه class 1 MHC presents the self-antigen to this self-reactive. Let's suppose that this is basically the self-reactive T cell. عندنا هنا TCR which binds to the MHC, and this is the HLA-B27 part presenting the self-antigen. When it binds, this defective protein will cause an abnormal activation of the self-reactive which cannot be suppressed. And as a result, what will happen? What will happen basically in the self-reactive T lymphocyte will be activated and will not be able to be suppressed. فبالتالي هذا يؤدي إلى autoimmunity. defect in this هذا البروسيس اللي تكلمت عنه خاصة لل HLA-B27 will lead to an autoimmune disease اللي هو ankylosing spondylitis. تمام؟ بس هذا ما يعتبر cause. شنو كاتبين هنا؟ كاتبين relative risk. It just increases the risk of the abnormal immune response. يعني abnormal immune response, which is basically the activation of the T lymphocytes. عندنا هسه أمراض ثانية اللي هو Rheumatoid Arthritis, Type 1 Diabetes mellitus, Pemphigus vulgaris. بس هذول إلها علاقة مثل ما تشوفون HLA-DR. شنو هذا الDR؟ هذول السبتايس مال class 2 MHC. class 2 MHC we have 3. We have HLA-DP, HLA-DQ, HLA-DR. نفس ال class 1 MHC. class 1 MHC كان عندنا A, B, C. أما بالنسبة ل class 2 we have DP, DQ, DR. Within the DR gene, it contains alleles, different alleles. These are the different alleles. A defect or a mutation of one of these alleles, يعني مثلا خلينا نفترض HLA-DR1 4 or 10 might lead to or increase the risk of rheumatoid arthritis by the same mechanism as I described for the ankylosing spondylitis. إذا صار مثلا DR4 مثلا increases the risk of pemphigus vulgaris. إذا صار بالنسبة لهذول الأليز increase the risk of type 1 diabetes. تمام. this is just the idea. المهم what we need to understand إنه class 2 MHC we have 3 genes DP, DQ, DR. These genes codes for proteins. These proteins come together, forms the complex, the major histocompatibility complex class 2, which are expressed on the APC. This is just the idea. وهنا عندنا genetic susceptibility to other genes that are involved in the autoimmunity. Other genes may influence the maintenance of tolerance by self-antigen, possibly by altering the normal regulation of the lymphocyte and or activation. عندنا هنا these are the other genes that can be altered and lead to autoimmunity. من ضمنها CTLA4. CTLA4 شنو هو؟ كان inhibitory receptor which basically inhibits the or suppresses the activation of T cells, which might lead to what? Which might lead to energy. How? It's an endocytotic. It decreases the number of B7 اللي هي secondary signal. مو قلنا انه كان عندنا مثلا ال APC. Let's suppose that this is the APC. It has it has MHC molecules and it has B7 for some reason. CTLA4 basically present on T cells or the regulatory T cells engulf these B7 اللي هي secondary signal which are needed and may lead to energy. عندنا مثلا هنا ال AIRE. A defect in this gene may lead to autoimmunity. هذا أخذناه احنا بالfirst semester. Its function is to eliminate the self-reactive T cells in the thymus. if there is a defect of this gene, there will be a defective protein. فما راح يصير اكو elimination self-reactive T cells. عندنا الفوكس P3 بالنسبة regulatory T cells. Deficiency of regulatory T cells. عندنا FAS which is responsible for apoptosis. Defective apoptosis of self-reactive T and B cells in the periphery. فهي هاي الفكرة. زين. هسه HLA-B27 is positive. هسه حكيناها in ankylosing spondylitis. Positive يعني there is a defect, there is a mutation. Ankylosing spondylitis. Rheumatoid arthritis كان غير شيء. كان HLA-DR4 or 1 or 10. SLE ما ذكرها. هذا ما ادري شنو اسمه syndrome هم ما ذكرها. this is the idea. يعني just try to know it. It's not that hard. Ankylosing spondylitis B27, rheumatoid arthritis DR1, DR4, DR10. Type 1 diabetes mellitus, I'm not sure if we should know it. Pemphigus vulgaris DR4. خلاص. Which of the following class 2 antigens would be most likely to play a contributing role in rheumatoid arthritis? هسه قلناها DR1 or DR4 or DR10. منو موجودة من عندها؟ DR4. this is the right answer. تمام؟ هياته. We can say that DR4 or more specific DRB. The second hypothesis when it comes to loss of self-tolerance is previous infections and or inflammatory responses. تمام؟ There are 6 major mechanisms that can promote this loss of tolerance. The first one, which is basically bystander T cell activation. شنو يعني? If you search the meaning of bystander, it means that being in a place at a specific or being in an event but you are not part of the event. تمام؟ شلون مثلا المؤتمر هذا آخر مؤتمر الإماراتي German, we are not part of this conference but we were there. هسه راح يبين شنو المقصود من كلامي. Infections in the tissues promote influx and activation of lymphocytes. Some of the lymphocytes that extravasate into the tissue may be self-reactive. APC in the infected tissue express co-stimulators as a result of microbial induced activation مثل ما وضح الفيجر B. APC can present both the foreign antigen and self-antigen in MHC along with B7. These activated APC in the tissue now can provide B7 co-stimulation to any self-reactive T cell that has been extravasated into the tissue due to the inflammatory response طبعا, and cause what? Autoimmune disease. هسه احنا normally when we have self-tolerance and autoimmune diseases, the APC that presents the self-antigen is immature. What does it mean by immature? It doesn't have the secondary signal اللي هي B7. فبالتالي this APC when it binds to the self-reactive, a self-reactive T cell will recognize the self-antigen that is present on the MHC, but ماكو secondary signal. وهذا راح يؤدي إلى شنو؟ راح يؤدي إلى energy or deletion. هذا الطبيعي، هذا اللي يصير يعني عندنا. بس مرات when there is a severe inflammation، هسه يعني فرضا مو inflammation، when there is an infection, a microbe has entered the body, for example in the arm. فال APC that are present in the arm engulf this foreign antigen, becomes what? Becomes mature. طبعا it migrates into the lymph nodes, becomes mature, and presents the pathogen antigen to the specific T cell. Will lead to what? Will lead to antigen specific activation of the T lymphocyte. تمام؟ هسه what will happen? What follows an infection generally? هو inflammation. خلال inflammation what happens is extravasation. These T cells that has been activated by antigen specific activation will proliferate and will differentiate. فاللي راح يصير هو انه extravasation from the blood vessels carrying many lymphocytes، خاصة بالsevere infections وهذا many lymphocytes including the activated lymphocytes, and sometimes شنو مكتوب هنا؟ lymphocytes that extravasate into the tissue may be self-reactive. وهذا يصير بالsevere infections, severe inflammations. inactivated or non-activated self-reactive T cells can travel with the activated lymphocytes that are specific for the pathogen that invaded the body into the tissue. هسه بالتشو شنو عندنا يعني in the arm we have the infection, الباتل. There is a battle going on. there we have the APC. بس APC هناك will it be activated or inactivated? أكيد راح تكون activated because there is a pathogen. And when it is activated شو حيكون عندها؟ it's mature. It contains the secondary signal اللي هي B7. اللي هي B7 مثل ما موضح هنا. وهذا APC for some reason can present both the pathogen antigen and the self antigen. واحنا قلنا انه self-reactive T cells have extravasated into the tissue, into the battle. when it recognizes the self antigen on the mature APC, B7 signal موجودة، ما راح يصير عندنا energy، ما راح يصير عندنا apoptosis اللي هو يصير بالحالة الطبيعية. اللي راح يصير هو activation of self-reactive T cells. فبالتالي راح يصير proliferation وراح يصير عندنا autoimmunity. تمام؟ فلذلك bystander, as I said, being at an event but not part of it. A self-reactive T cell is present at the infection site. Okay? بس هي it's not part of the immune response. It's not part of the immune response against the pathogen. بس هي خلال event it got activated by the already mature APC. فهي هاي الفكرة. example, it happens in type 1 diabetes. Number 2, molecular mimicry. I think it's simple for you. Molecular mimicry, a self-reactive T cell is already present. Some pathogen contain antigens that are similar, that have a similar sequence to the self antigen of of many proteins of our body. Microbial antigens that are similar to self-antigen can activate B and T cells, producing cross-reaction, autoimmunity. تمام. One of the examples اللي هو rheumatic fever. بالrheumatic fever, how is it caused? Basically group A streptococcus. group A اللي هي شنو كانت البيتا hemolytic. For some people that have the self-reactive T cell, شو يصير when they get infected by strep A, group A strep infection, it has a similar sequence to what? To the meromycin. Meromycin is basically a protein present in the heart valve. فبالتالي شو يصير when the antigen of the bacteria is presented to the self-reactive T cell, it gets activated. So basically مثل ما موضح هنا, الميكروبال antigen, it's like a chance, it's فرصة للself-reactive T cell in order to be activated without the need of the meromycin. فبالتالي when it's activated راح تروح للميرومايسين and start attacking it. It's self-reactive. فهي هاي الفكرة. وعندنا هنا هواية أمراض autoimmune diseases that are caused by infection. مثلا insulin receptor and rabies virus have similar sequence. فبالتالي if you have self-reactive T cells that are basically that are يعني specific for the insulin receptor, and the person got infected with rabies, there is a high chance that these self-reactive T cells will be activated. T cells will activate the B cells, فبالتالي راح يصير عندنا auto antibodies, autoimmunity, فراح يصير عندنا diabetes. فهنا ثالثا عندنا polyclonal lymphocyte activation, the third mechanism. هنا بهاي الحالة اللي يصير هو non-specific activation of T or B cells. شلون؟ هسه نشوف. بالنسبة للبي cell, there is a virus called the Epstein-Barr virus. أخذناه قبل. The Epstein-Barr virus, when it affects, it targets what? It targets the B cells. When it affects the B cells, it activates it without a signal. It just activates it. مثل ما تلاحظون, non-specifically it's activated. فبالتالي this B cell can be self-reactive. طبعا Epstein-Barr virus can infect any B cell. لسوء الحظ, for يعني bad luck, هذه البي cell كانت self-reactive and it got activated by the Epstein-Barr virus, and then it started producing antibodies against the body tissue, فصار عندنا autoimmune disease. بالتي cells الexample هو super antigens. السوبر antigens can be an exotoxin produced by what? By bacteria. احنا قلنا انه T cell, in order to be activated, we need two signals. First of all, we need what? We need the antigen carried on an MHC binds to T cell receptor. Then we need a B7 signal which binds to CD28. تمام. لكن بالنسبة للسوبر antigen, without the presence of the secondary signal اللي هي B7 and without the presence of the antigen, ماكو antigen مثل ما تلاحظون هنا, there is no antigen. اللي يصير انه صار اكو anchoring between ال MHC2 وال T cell receptor. This is staph enterotoxin. It caused activation of the T cell, non-specific activation for the T cells. And لسوء الحظ, unfortunately, this T cell, there is a chance that it can be self-reactive. So when it's activated, it will lead to autoimmunity. فهاي هي الفكرة. نجي هسه للaltered self. The fourth mechanism. Self-antigens can be altered and thus perceived as foreign. يعني هي بالطبيعة initially it was self-antigen وأكو self-tolerance وماكو any autoimmunity. For some reason, alteration happened to this self-antigen, وبسبب هذا alteration it became foreign. There are two examples. The first example اللي هي الهابتين. أخذناها بالفاونديشن. الهابتين basically binds to self-antigen. When it binds to self-antigen, it will form a new complex, new antigen, which is considered to be foreign. تمام؟ بس هو يعني this foreign antigen still contains the self-antigen. بس هي under the supervision of the immune system is considered to be foreign. It will stimulate an autoimmune response, activate T cells or B cells, will attack the the self-antigen. One example اللي هو penicillin derived hemolytic anemia. أخذناها احنا. البنسلين contains beta-lactam ring, and we took with Prof Iman إنه البeta-lactam, one of the adverse effects is that it can bind to what? Can bind to the red blood cell. Red blood cell is considered to be self-antigen. When it binds to it, drug is considered to be a hapten. It will lead to alteration of the self-antigen, considered foreign by the body. Antibodies will be produced against this and will attack the red blood cell and cause hemolytic anemia. The second example اللي هو enzymatic modification of the antigen, mainly citrullination. Citrullination من اسمها, it's a process where arginine amino acid is converted into citrulline. هسه احنا self antigen is basically what? It's a peptide, and peptide consists of many amino acids. One of the amino acid can be an arginine. There is an enzyme called PAD, peptidyl arginine deaminase. It removes what? Imine group from the arginine and replace it with oxygen, which produces the citrulline. And this citrullinated self-antigen is altered and is considered to be foreign by the body. Therefore, راح يصير اكو activation للself reactive T cell إذا كانت موجودة. فبالتالي لما يصير activation للself reactive, بالتالي راح يصير إنه antibodies against the self antigen, فراح يصير اكو عندنا autoimmunity. 5. Release of sequestered antigens. Self antigens يعني مثلا البروتينز, هاي الاشياء الموجودة بالimmunologically privileged sites. شنو هي هاي السايتس؟ where the immune supervision and surveillance is not present, like the nervous system, particularly the brain, the eye, the ovaries, the testes. Basically, it contains antigens and proteins that are not shown, that were not presented during the selection of the lymphocytes, during maturation. So basically, no education happened. انه التي lymphocytes والبي lymphocyte ما عرفوا انه هذول self antigens, so it considers it as foreign. فبالتالي due to a specific injury, when there is a specific injury, for example the eye, blood can, basically hemorrhage can happen in the eye. فبlood, when it reaches the sequestered antigens, they are noticed by the immune system. So basically, T cells against these self-antigens can be activated. B cells can be activated, which will then lead to autoimmunity. So they are newly exposed and may be recognized as foreign. لاحظوا maybe, مو دائما. Maybe a person do not have the self-reactive. So it's just like a chance. One example, عندنا we have ocular trauma, which will lead to autoimmune uveitis. Ocular trauma exposes the sequestered antigens to the immune system, which has produced what? Which has produced antibodies against what? The retina of the eye. تمام? Second example, we have multiple sclerosis. Then, lastly, we have the availability of cryptic epitopes. Then, some molecules may shelter epitopes, antigenic epitopes, in the interior from the contact with the immune system. If these molecules are altered, denatured, these epitopes may be exposed to the immune system, considered as foreign, and basically an immune response is developed against it. One example اللي هو rheumatoid factor الموجود بالrheumatoid arthritis. شنو هو الريماتويد فاكتورز؟ IgM antibodies against the FC region. FC is present in the constant region of the antibody of the IgG. IgM is created in response to هذا. How does this happen? Basically, we have a normal free IgG antibody. مثل ما تلاحظون, this is the variable region. This is the constant region. And the constant region, it contains a region called the FC. An epitope, unknown, can bind to this IgG. لو تشوفون على constant region, changes occurred. This binding has led to a conformational change of the constant region, particularly the FC region, which has exposed carbohydrates. These carbohydrates are considered to be foreign, antigenic, an epitope. فبالتالي, what will happen is that the body will produce an IgM antibody. The IgM antibody will target this carbohydrate. IgM is bound to the constant region of IgG. هذا كله اسمه الريماتويد factor. وهذا الريماتويد factor will aggregate in the joints and cause the problems that we will discuss later. نجي هسه هذا السؤال. A 41-year-old informs her physician that in her childhood she experienced 2 bouts of rheumatic fever. Although she appears to be well and at present, which of the following of rheumatic fever is most likely to present as a chronic disease in her later years? Arthritis, it's more of an acute one. Fibrinous pericarditis, inflammation, acute inflammation, fibrinous type. Myocarditis, ما له علاقة. Neurological diseases, ما له علاقة. The rheumatic fever, what is targeted mainly, mitral valve, heart valves. So the chronic disease is mitral valve stenosis, mitral valve disease, sorry. مثل ما موضح هنا. زين. خلصنا هسه causes or the hypothesis of the autoimmunity, loss of self-tolerance. نجي هسه على categories of autoimmune diseases. You have 2 types. You have organ-specific autoimmunity and we have systemic autoimmunities. First of all, we have the organ-specific. The organ-specific immune response is directed to a specific self-antigen in one organ, gland or tissue. And clinical symptoms are limited to that organ specifically. It's not specific. Can be humoral, can be cell-mediated, cellular, B-cell, T-cell. Often type 2 hypersensitivity. Can be type 4 طبعا. بس ليش type 2? This type of autoimmunity is considered to be organ specific. So the immune system is targeting specific antigens to that organ. وهاي الانتيجين is expressed where? In the cells of that organ. تمام? These antigens are fixed. So when they are fixed, هنا type of hypersensitivity عندنا الcytotoxic hypersensitivity اللي هي type 2 hypersensitivity. فالantibody binds to the antigen, فبالتالي it can activate complement, cause complement activation, can activate the macrophages causing phagocytosis, can activate ADCC. إذا تتذكروها إنه الانتيبادي binds to the antigen, بعدين يجي natural killer cells binds to the antibody, وبالتالي leads to apoptosis of that cell. فهذا organ specific type 2 hypersensitivity, don't forget it. Second type of autoimmunity عندنا systemic autoimmunity. Autoantibodies are formed against antigens that are common in many tissue. Can be connective tissue, vascular tissue, rheumatologic disorders. Connective tissue is nearly present in every organ, in every part in our body. So if there is autoimmunity to a specific part of the connective tissue, like collagen, هنا راح يكون systemic. نفس الشيء الفاسكولار، نفس الشيء الروماتولوجيك. We're gonna explain how. And this type of autoimmunity is considered to be type 3 hypersensitivity. شنو كان type 3 hypersensitivity؟ الانتيجين is considered to be soluble, not on a cell, not attached to a cell, not a part of the cell. التايب 2 مثل ما قلنا we have a fixed antigen on a cell. اما type 3 hypersensitivity we have a soluble antigen by itself circulating around the blood. فبالتالي اللي راح يصير انه antibodies will bind to these antigens, will form immune complexes and will deposit in many tissues around the body. And this is which disease particularly? This is systemic lupus erythematosus. تمام؟ فهي هذه الفكرة. Systemic can be type 2 or type 4 but mainly type 3. فمن هذا الكلام نقدر نقول إنه systemic autoimmunity we have a broad range of target antigens involving a number of organs and tissue. A general defect in immune regulation leading to hyperactive T and B cell autoimmunity. Tissue damage is extensive as a result of both cell-mediated immunity and humoral responses. الأوتو antibodies can cause direct cellular damage. هاي بالنسبة للtype 2 cellular damage. So the antigen is fixed on the cell. يعني عندنا هسه السل هنا وعندنا this is the antigen. يجي الantibody binds to this antigen. So when it binds to this antigen مثل ما قلت it can either activate the complement, will lead to formation of the MAC complex, will lead to inflammation, can recruit macrophages and activate them, can cause death by ADCC. تجي natural killer cells attached to the constant region and cause death. This is type 2 hypersensitivity. Type 3 hypersensitivity, deposition of immune complexes مثل ما قلت, systemic lupus erythematosus, soluble antigens circulating around the body, circulating around the body, antibody EG binds to this antigen, forms complexes, deposition in different types of tissue. This is for the systemic. Type 2 للشنو للorgan specific. Type 4 T cell mediated damage. تمام. Most of these systemic autoimmunities are associated with the presence of anti-nuclear antibodies. اكو حتى antibodies against the nucleus. يعني it enters the cell and it targets the nucleus. This anti-nuclear antibody can be positive in rheumatoid arthritis, for example, or many autoimmune diseases. بس شغلة كلش مهمة إنه a positive ANA does not mean that the patient has an autoimmune disorder. It's just an indicator. تمام؟ هاي هي الفكرة. نجي هسه لهذا السؤال. مكتوب هنا a 12-year-old has a temperature of 102.5 Fahrenheit and a sore throat. 2 days later she develops diffuse erythematous rash. So there is a rash. Taken to her pediatrician. On physical examination there is circumoral paler region around the mouth, basically. Rash with areas of desquamation. The myocardial damage that can follow this infection is produced by the manner similar to the damage associated which of the following. زين لاحظوا this 12-year-old girl got an infection مثل ما تلاحظون انه there is fever, there is a rash وهاي الاشياء. بس بعدين صار عندنا شنو myocardial damage. هذا يشبه شيء اخذناه هسه قبل شويه. Rheumatic fever. Which type of hypersensitivity is it? Is it type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4? Rheumatic fever is considered to be type 2. تمام؟ فإحنا هم دي يطلبوا من عندنا a disease that is similar to the rheumatic fever. أول شيء atopic allergy. Allergy, is it type 2? No, it's type 1. فغلط. Contact dermatitis أخذناها. type 4 غلط. Graft versus host type 4 غلط. Graves disease. Graves disease is considered to be type 2 hypersensitivity. بس الميكانيزم مختلفة. بالروماتيك فيفر الانتيبودي targets the meromycin, causes destruction of the heart valves. تمام. اما بالنسبة للجريفز ديزيز هنا مختلفة. هنا الانتيبودي mimics a hormone called TSH, binds to the thyroid gland, causes hyperthyroidism. So it's considered type 2, however not the same mechanism. فغلط. Idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura هو الجواب الصح. Type 2 hypersensitivity is similar mechanism. Myasthenia gravis غلط. أتصور لأنه myasthenia I think we should know them. It's type 2 hypersensitivity بس نفس الكلام بالنسبة للجريفز disease. Not cytotoxic variety. Antibodies basically attaches to acetylcholine receptor. تمام. Rheumatoid arthritis غلط. It's a type 3 hypersensitivity. Serum sickness type 3 hypersensitivity. Systemic lupus erythematosus type 3 hypersensitivity. فجواب الصح هو هذا idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura. إن شاء الله تكون شغلة واضحة. نيجي هسه للrheumatoid arthritis. Chronic inflammation of the joint, gets worse by time, it's progressive, leads to impairment of function, destruction of cartilage, destruction of bones, most commonly found in females, particularly young adults aged between 20 and 40 years old. والpathogenesis مالتها it involves both arms of the adaptive immunity, the humoral اللي هي plasma cells, the B cells that produces autoantibodies, والcellular immunity اللي هي T cells. Increased IG in serum, تمام, antibodies in the serum increases, and the hallmark of rheumatoid arthritis انه خلص نقول هذا rheumatoid arthritis is the rheumatoid factor. شنو هو rheumatoid factor? IgM antibody basically binded to what? To the FC region of the IgG antibody. Basically forms the rheumatoid factor. Rheumatoid factor start to be deposited in the joints, which will cause the inflammation and هو arthritis. فبالتالي from this we can know which type of hypersensitivity. It's considered to be type 3 hypersensitivity. ليش؟ IgG is soluble in the blood. يجي IgM binds to what? Binds to the exposed carbohydrate. مو احنا قلنا الكريبتيك epitope انه epitope binds to the IgG, causes conformational change, exposes the carbohydrate. IgM يجي binds to the FC region اللي هو يعني which contains the carbohydrate. فبالتالي forms the rheumatoid factor, start to be deposited into the joints. type 3 hypersensitivity. The clinical image of it, symmetric inflammation of small joints. symmetric يعني إذا بالإيد اليمين موجودة فموجودة أيضا بالإيد اليسار. فبالتالي من هذا الكلام نقدر نكتشف إنه هو systemic autoimmune disease because it involves multiple joints اللي هي joints of the hands, feet, later include the ankle, wrist, elbow, shoulder, jaws, only rarely hips. يعني بالأخير it will lead to deformation, deformity and loss of function of the joint. أتصور term was ankylosis, basically fixation of the joint. خلاص الجوينت GG بعد ما راح يتحرك. ننزل هسه تحت. Rheumatoid arthritis, as we said, is a systemic autoimmune disease. Genetic, host and environmental factors contribute to the breakdown of tolerance to self-antigen. Genetic, we explained how. Environmental factors includes smoking and air pollution. Smoking and air pollution with the genetic causes can lead to epigenetic changes. epigenetic شنو كانت؟ عندنا الميثylation, الacetylation وهاي الأشياء. وأيضا triggering events which leads to emotional trauma also trigger the rheumatoid arthritis. تمام؟ فهسه اللي راح يصير إنه activation of the self-reactive T and B cells trigger the synovial hypertrophy, swelling, chronic joint inflammation. وهنا increased risk associated with HLA-DR4 اللي هو شنو؟ القليل. نرجع هسه بالبداية شنو كان عندنا هنا؟ كان عندنا هياتا rheumatoid arthritis MHC قليل, HLA-DR عندنا 1 وعندنا 4 وعندنا 10. 4 relative risk مالتها between 4 and 12. So it increases the risk of rheumatoid arthritis if mutation happened to that gene by 4 to 12 times. This is the idea that we must know. فهنا مثل ما تشوفون يعني chronic inflammation we have يعني العشيرة كلها موجودة هنا. T cells, الcytokines, TNF alpha, interleukins, البي cells, الماس cells. لاحظوا T cells والبي cells فبالتالي it involves a humoral and cellular dendritic cell macrophages جمعة مسوين. المهم فالريماتويد arthritis الauto antibodies there are 3 auto antibodies that are found in the rheumatoid arthritis. First of all اللي قلناه هو rheumatoid factor IgM auto antibody against the FC region of IgG. We explained why. Cryptic epitopes. The carbohydrate is exposed. IgM against that carbohydrate is produced. فبالتالي راح يصير اكو عندنا rheumatoid factor will be deposited into the joints and will cause the inflammation. ACPA اللي هو anti citrullinated peptide antibody. It includes 2. It includes ACCP and AMCV. شنو مكتوب هنا؟ Citrulination alters the protein. اللي هو which mechanism we took? Alter of self. وينها؟ يا لحظة. هذه altered self. Enzymatic modification of the antigen. Arginine is converted to citrulline فبالتالي راح يصير عندنا alteration of the self antigen will make it foreign. تمام؟ And self-reactive T cells and B cells will be activated against that. And what will be produced اللي هو ACCP اللي هو anti-cyclic citrullinated peptide. وراح يصير عندنا AMCV اللي هو anti-mutated citrullinated vimentin. فبالتالي لما نسوي blood test and we find this high and this high وراح نشوف الريماتويد factor is a hallmark diagnosis of what? Of rheumatoid arthritis. ثالثا عندنا ال ANA anti-nuclear antibodies. Anti-nuclear antibodies اي صح anti-nuclear antibodies specifically RA33 heterogeneous nuclear ribonucleoprotein helps explain why 40% of RA patients have a positive ANA titer. لاحظوا 40% يعني not all of them. So positive ANA does not mean that autoimmune disease. We mentioned that earlier. فهي هاي الشغلة. لاحظوا هنا mechanism that happens due to inflammation by this bacteria or smoking or the epigenetic changes or genetic changes راح يؤدي إلى protein citrullination. فراح يصير راح ينتج anti CCP. Immune complex is formed and deposited in a joint. فبالتالي immune complexes will activate شنو? Will activate the complement. The complement will activate what? Macrophages. And will activate what? يعني macrophages will be activated راح يصير recruitment للنيوتروفيلز فراح يصير مثل يعني inflammation basically. Cytokines will be produced. TNF alpha, interleukin 1, interleukin 6 will cause pain, will cause fever. فبالتالي راح يؤدي إلى rheumatoid arthritis اللي هو مذكور هنا. فبالتالي which 2 mechanisms of rheumatoid arthritis is mentioned here? 2. Cryptic epitopes اللي هو مع rheumatoid factor. وثانيا altered self اللي هو citrullination due to smoking, due to genetic changes, due to emotional trauma and so on. زين هسه rheumatoid arthritis autoreactive T and B cells are activated. Same thing we said. High levels of helper T cell 1, helper T cell 17. Helper T cell 1 الفانكشن مالتها شنو؟ تجيب النيوتروفيلز، تجيب الايزينوفيلز، activate the macrophages, activate the cytotoxic T cells. الhelper T cell 17 what it does is that it recruits macrophages and neutrophils to the site. فمثل ما قلنا resulting in type 3 hypersensitivity. وهاي الشغلة هنا البروسيس I explained the structure كلها pathophysiology يعني try to relate it to pathophysiology. وبالأخير هنا مثل ما قلت immune complex deposit in the joints where they activate the complement هسه قلتها stimulate inflammation resulting in chronic inflammation and cell mediated responses. The helper T cell will activate macrophages, will activate cytotoxic T cells, will activate the B cells in order to produce more antibodies. فكلها مربوطات ببعض. فمثل ما تلاحظون هنا T cell is activated. T cell activate B cell. B cell produces antibodies. Antibodies will form immune complexes اللي هي rheumatoid factor ACCP و AMCV. فراح يؤدي ال complement activation. Complement activation activate the macrophages. Macrophages will be activated. Macrophages will produce cytokines TNF alpha, interleukin 1, interleukin 6, and will produce substance that will cause the synoviocytes اللي هو ال cells that forms the synovial membrane to proliferate. تمام. It will stimulate the fibroblast in order to proliferate, which will lead to erosion. It will stimulate the osteoclast to be activated, so it will cause يعني destruction of the bone. بالتالي كلها راح يؤدي إلى systemic manifestation, cartilage and bone damage, و synovial inflammatory proliferation مثل ما قلنا. وشغلة ثانية إنه we have low C3 and C4 in RA after being used to clear immune complexes. The complement, when it's activated, one of its functions is that it wants to get rid of that immune complex that is activated the complement, particularly C3 C4. فبالتالي لما we do a blood test in rheumatoid arthritis patients we will find low C3 and C4. وهاي الرسمة تربط كل شيء هسه اللي قلته. And these are the drugs that are used in order to make or alleviate rheumatoid arthritis or reduce the progression. يعني these are the drugs. يعني try to study it by yourself, pharmacology, related to pharmacology. وإن شاء الله تكونوا استفادتوا وكل التوفيق.